Welcome to the module on Political Economy of Fiscal Institutions. The discussions of the fiscal institutions has a lot of historical foundations. First of all, in any type of economy, whether it's a modernized economy or a traditional economy, fiscal institutions play a critical role in its functioning. Basically, fiscal institutions deal with a lot of mechanisms that are governing the collection and the expenditure of the public funds. That is the method of the collection of the public funds and how the expenditure is being done. They are taken up by the fiscal institutions. These are driven by a number of political and economic factors which design and implementation of the fiscal policies. So any kind of political ideologies or changes in the political factors along with the economic rationale, all of them develop an understanding of these fiscal institutions. Moreover, whenever we look at the fiscal institution and its relevance, we basically want to find out what are the determinants of these institutions and how they are playing together, particularly in their economic outcomes. So outcomes may be economic in nature in terms of the generation of livelihood, in terms of the distribution of income, but actually the inputs are generated from both the dynamics of politics and economics. Fiscal institutions also help in the building up of public finance, particularly in the management of the public resources. And also it is an integral part of the macroeconomics because it deals with the dynamics of economic growth and how the different macroeconomic indicators are playing an important role. So actually as a part of the government policy, how the resources are to be diverted, how the public spending is to be done, so it is considered one of the crucial component of the government policy in that regard. The role of the fiscal institutions comes up a very important case when we look at the designing of the policies. Because fiscal institutions are a critical part of a modern political economy, which basically takes up a range of economic factors. So how they do? First of all, these fiscal institutions have some specific economic objectives, and that are taken up as the top priority. One of them is balancing the budget. So balancing the budget actually takes care of any kind of expenditure taken up measures when it overshoots the revenue collection. Because it is seen that in any developing nation, the expenditure behavior is quite reckless, and how it can be taken up by the revenue generation of the state, that is basically a challenge. So a balance between the tax and an expenditure policy needs to be taken up. And that is how a budget balancing act comes in. Secondly, we talk about the inflation management. Because when we deal with the inflation management, it basically refers to the price stabilization and how different kind of demand and supply measures can be taken up. Economic growth is also one of the major concern in this regard because whatever be the policy, the most important impact is on the growth mechanism. So as a result, we can see that the fiscal institutions deal with a lot of mechanisms starting from the taxation policy, expenditure policy, borrowing policy, and finally when we look after the management of the debts, because debt management refers to the debt servicing that is being done. So when we look at the fiscal institutions which actually depend upon the framing, the designing and the implementation of the fiscal policies, and which are absolutely shaped by number of factors, like the political factors, the economic factors, the political ideologies that are taken up, the institutional structures that are taken up, and most importantly, the decision making, which is the public opinion making conditions. So all these are inherent within the structure of the political economy. Moreover, when we refer to any kind of fiscal institutions, and we refer to a political economic structure, then the government fiscal policies and institutions play an important role. Because this involves a lot of the fiscal policies including tax, the expenditure making decisions, and how they are affecting the economic growth, and finally referring to the income distribution. So in most of the cases, it is seen that any kind of government policy is leading to a kind of inefficient distribution of wealth, or rather the degree of inequality is on the rise. So this is basically taken up by the political economy agenda, where the fiscal institutions play an important role. Mainly when we design the tax structure, when we design the expenditure system, and also we look at the effectiveness of the government policy, that is very important, that also requires the fiscal institutions to take up. Because any kind of fiscal institutions thereby depend upon how the public opinion and the effectiveness of the government policy are taken care of. So when we look at the role of the interest groups, these interest groups basically refers to different kind of clusters of the communities that are developing in an emerging nation, which can refer to the NGOs, which can refer to the self-help groups, it can refer to any kind of microfinance institutions or any such kind of interest groups that are emerging. Political parties, which are considered as one of the most important stakeholders in this entire agenda of fiscal institutions. Individual politicians also come up in the shaping of these policies. So it is basically how the economic factors, the state of the economy, particularly the political structure of the economy, which takes care of political stability. Moreover, the global economic conditions, very important, because in a globalized economy, any kind of global event will have an effect on the socio-economic fabric of the country and how they are interacting with the political forces to influence the fiscal policies. So the determinants of fiscal policies are not only confined within the economic dimensions, it is basically more influenced by the political, the socio-economic, and even the global factors or the global phenomena that are taking place. For example, the exit of Britain or the Brexit that is considered, which is basically a political ideological difference, has a tremendous effect on the taxation policy of United States. It has been seen that the political economy of fiscal institutions also examine the impact of the fiscal policy. Because any kind of fiscal policy, when it is coming up, it has an impact mechanism is done, or impact evaluation study is being done. And these are done on the grounds of economic growth, whether the economic growth is compromised or the economic growth is accelerated. The degree of the income inequality, the social welfare, all these are taken up under the distributional effects of the fiscal policies, such that it can affect the income groups as well as the regions. Moreover, it has been seen that any impact of fiscal policy also provides some incentives for work, investment, and entrepreneurship. Because this also makes clear that whenever we look at any kind of economic structure, then the series of the global events that take place also change the dynamism of the political economy, and any kind of investment behavior is taken care of. So understanding the political and the economic forces are very much important for understanding the government effectiveness, and thereby the long-term consequences can be taken care of. So the field of this entire study is not only for the scholars but also for the citizens and also for the policy makers. So the understanding of the political and the fiscal institutions, because these fiscal institutions have to operate within a political framework. So that will make it more effective, more efficient if all these dynamics are taken care of, particularly with the objective of promoting economic growth, reduction in the inequality, and enhancing the social welfare. So in overall, we can see how the citizens can be more informed, how these communicative channels can be more robust without any lack of coordination, how can the elected officials contribute to a more transparent and accountable government, because that can be done only through the implementation of fiscal policies at right times. This goes back to the discussions of political ideology, because fiscal institution may be economic in nature, but the designing of the fiscal institution has to take care of the changes in the political ideologies over time, as the ruling parties keep on changing in any dynamic democratic society. So first of all, political ideology plays an important role in designing and shaping of the fiscal policy. So different political ideologies means different kind of agenda or dynamics they follow. There can be some conservative approach. So conservative approach might lead to lower level of government taxes, lower level of spending, and less government intervention. But there can be more and more modern and sophisticated mode of operation where everything is left under the market forces. So thereby the person who is earning more or the richer to be taxed more, and the economy will go for a progressive mode of taxation. So this is embedded within how the economy is grasping with the changes in ideologies. In contrast, when we look at the progressive ideologies, then it referred to more progressive taxation, greater government intervention. So we can see that two types of ideologies may operate. In Indian economy, basically before 90s, a more conservatism approach was there because it was seen that the socialistic economy was coming up. Public sector were taken up the commanding heights. So any kind of low tax, more of government spending, more of welfare-oriented measures were taken up. But with the current times and with the advent of globalization, it has been seen that more progressive mode of taxation is preferred because this goes in tune with the progressive ideologies. So the influence of the political ideology is actually more and more enigmatic because it takes care of the design of the tax systems, how the progressive taxation can favor the government, or how the regressive taxation can be more taken up by the conservative ideologies. So changes in ideologies are dynamic, they are not static, and with these changes, the fiscal policy has to modify its regulations. So the design of public expenditure programs also goes in same tune. Just like the designing of taxing policy, the designing of the expenditure program. Because whether the conservatives favor small government programs, progressive favor more government programs, this also is being determined not only by economic resource availability, but also by the priority of the economy. Because if the economy or the political economy basically stresses on the voters or on the propaganda based on the voters' rights, and what segment of the votes come in from which stratum of the society, then either it can go for more spending, particularly in the merit goods like health, education, or on the other hand, it goes for low spending if it is more and more giving space to the capitalist classes. So it is absolutely driven by the political ideology, how these are effectively affecting the fiscal policies. This goes back to the institutional structures. When we discuss on the institutional structures, it's basically looking at a framework or an organizational structure actually. Because any kind of policy will operate under the setting up of an organizational capital. And this organizational capital must have the legal and the regulatory framework. They should operate within the political and the bureaucratic institutions so that they can implement these policies. So this design must also be embedded in the government effectiveness, where there should be independent fiscal institutions, because these fiscal institutions should have their own autonomy. This is very much important because they should not be influenced by any kind of bureaucratic or any kind of political control. Then only we can say that a budgetary process can be more transparent, can be more accountable, and the presence of the fiscal rules can help in constrain government spending and borrowing. Because any kind of constraint policy to reduce government spending might be detrimental if the government effectiveness is not taken care of. So it is seen that the design of the budgetary procedures, implementation of the fiscal policies, all of them affect the political influence. So all these are basically being driven by political influence and manipulation. Though manipulation is very negative to sound, but actually any kind of political dynamics must take care of all these factors, because these are some of the adverse factors which can make the world to live in a world of bad governance. Because institutional structures play an important role in this regard. Next we come on to the very, very important component of a political structure or a political framework, that is the electoral systems. Because these electoral systems influence the fiscal institutions, and that is how the synergy comes between the economic and the political ideologies. So countries with proportional representations tend to have gone for a coalition government, which lead to a more fragmented decision making on fiscal policy. Fragmented decision making means each of the decision making is more driven by personal interest of the groups so that they can get the benefit without any kind of overall beneficial mode. Like different parties can have different preferences for tax and spending priorities. That is not actually desirable for an overall economy to function, because this will result to class conflict. But countries with a two-party system, on the other hand, tend to have more stable and predictable fiscal institutions, as two parties tend to have similar preference on the fiscal policy. That means more we go for fragmentation of political parties, more we go for fragmentation of electoral systems, more complicated the political structure would be. And thereby, there can be a kind of a policy gridlock where different compartments will be there who will prefer different kind of fiscal policy mechanisms. And if this comes in, then it will be very difficult to coordinate in the long run with different preferences coming from different heads. On the other hand, if we look for a two-party system, then we can get a more stable and a more predictable fiscal institutions, because they can have more similar type of preferences and easier to operate in the long run. So here, in order to monitor and in order to make a good surveillance of all these systems, there is a role of judiciary, because this judiciary role is very critical. So independent judiciaries should have an executive branch that will ensure the fiscal policy to have some legal and constitutional constraints. So when I look at the legal and constitutional constraints, they should look after the fiscal discipline, and there should not be any kind of fiscal instability. That is very important, that the instability behavior of the fiscal policy should be taken up, because otherwise the economic growth has to be compromised. This brings in the linkage between the role of fiscal institutions and economic growth, because fiscal institutions are considered to be one of the most important pillars of economic growth. First of all, it looks for a well-designed fiscal system. So when we look at the well-designed fiscal system, we need how public investment can come up. And this public investment can be embedded on infrastructure, education, research and development. So whenever we look at all these four important agenda of a fiscal institution, definitely there should be provision to generate revenue and allocate resources. Then only the fiscal sustainability can be taken care of. So one of them is definitely taxation, which requires for a more canons of taxation, like the principles of taxation, like efficient, equitable, transparent. Then only revenue generation can be direct, and the distortionary effects on the economy can be reduced. That means any kind of inefficient mechanism on the economy can be reduced. Efficient tax system work on the act of compliance. That means the procedural delays or any kind of multiplicity in the tax rate, all these are adding cost to this system. So hence there should be reduction in that, and the burden of the tax also can be reduced, particularly on the oppressive classes. So whenever we look at an efficient tax system to be one of the agenda of the fiscal institutions, it looks after the equitable distribution of the tax and also more accountable and transparent tax system so that the scope for corruption can be mitigated. Fiscal institutions also call for budgeting and expenditure management processes, because this also looks into the issue how the expenditure can be mitigated or can be channelized, because this calls for the diversion of the public resources. So when we look at effective budgeting processes, when we look at management processes, all of them makes the resource to be used more efficiently and effectively so that it can address the three important dynamics of the good governance. One is definitely transparency in terms of accountability, and strong institutional capacity. The strong institutional capacity is depending on a very, very effective government role and how the institution can have a broad approach towards this budgeting process. This brings in to the discussion on role of fiscal institutions in economic development. Because when we look at the economic development, it actually looks at more broader picture than economic growth. Because economic development basically refers to the management of the public funds from the point of collection to the point of distribution, or rather utilization. So when we look at the fiscal discipline, we basically refer to transparency issue, accountability, good governance, and then only these are conducive for the economic development. And that is also very much important for the macroeconomic stability, because any kind of macroeconomic stability calls for macroeconomic reforms which have the global agenda. Moreover, we have actually seen that under the public finance, the most important problem is with the debt management. So the government should not overspend or accumulate debt beyond the sustainable levels. And this can be done by some deficit targets so that there can be consistent application of these debt issues. So these debt issues must be very strictly followed. Social welfare program, which is taken up as one of the most important mode of government expenditure program, should be taken care of the expenditure reforms. Because in most of the cases we have seen the conditional cash transfer, which may be effective in reducing poverty in the developing countries. Because when we look at the cash transfer programs, they basically provide cash assistance to the low-income families and help to meet their basic needs. And the public health care programs can also be taken up in order to afford to the low-income families. So these are some of the priorities that the nation has from time to time. And based on the political agenda, this type of cash transfer programs are taken up. So impact of these fiscal institutions also have some kind of impact on the inequality measurement, because it is seen that in the economic structure, inequality is measured by Gini coefficient, which lies from perfect equality of 0 to perfect inequality of 1. That is how the statistical values are calculated. So it is seen that whenever all these social elements come up in the picture, like rise in inequality, rise in poverty, all of these are making clear that the economic fiscal discipline should be taken care of. So poverty rates also makes the same, which is a percentage of the population living below an income threshold. So effectiveness of the fiscal policies plays an important role in this regard. And in addition to these direct effects of the fiscal policies, fiscal institutions also play an important role in economic growth and development. Because all these implementation can be possible if the fiscal system is well designed. That is actually the organizational capital, that is actually the organizational structure that the economy should look into. And that well-designed tax system involves proper incentives, proper resource allocation mechanism, and proper budget allocations. So it is seen that if a country has a very poor managed tax system, where the tax administrative procedures are highly complicated, no accountability standards are maintained, and moreover the taxation policy is also overburdened, then definitely the future investments and the growth projections will be affected. So basically the fiscal institutions have a significant impact on the inequality and also on the poverty. Because any kind of progressive taxation, any kind of social welfare program will definitely lead to the resources from the haves to the have-nots. And then only we can see the fiscal system will be efficient in its operations. When we look at the policy makers and thereby look at the designing and the implementation process of the fiscal policy, then they're effective in promoting the social and the economic development, particularly in reducing the poverty and inequality. Then only all these matters can be taken care of. So, the question rises on the influence of the political institutions on the fiscal policy. Because whenever we look at the setting up of a fiscal institution or designing of the fiscal policy, then what can be the impact of these political institutions? Because these are absolutely embedded in its initial or the nascent stage. One of them is taken up from the designing and implementation of the fiscal institutions, behavior of the political actors, impact on the competition and accountability, and actually on the designing of the policy. So when we look at the fiscal rules, these are some of the legal and constitutional provisions that are being done. Because these are taken up to actually help the government to deal with the debt management issues if the debt goes beyond the limits. And that is why we look for a balanced budget requirement, some kind of ceilings on the debt, and most importantly, how the reckless public expenditure spending can be mitigated. Because this comes as a reckless in the long run. Initially, any kind of short-term mechanisms cannot take up, but in the long run, it becomes more reckless. So fiscal institutions basically refer to some kind of organizational structure, how the facilitation can take place of the tax finances, takes care of the treasury, central bank, and the tax administration. So when we look at this treasury, we look at basically the entire economic factors. Role of the central bank also plays an important role, and the administrative procedures taken up in the fiscal institutional system. Moreover, it is also being influenced by political factors like the level of political consensus on the fiscal policy objectives. This is very, very important. Because any kind of fiscal policy has to go through a cabinet, and there should be a political consensus on the policies which are taken up. And this consensus must take care of the interest of all the groups in the community or in the society. And this is also embedded with the degree of trust in the government. So in all these cases, we can see that a high level of consensus is required before the policies are being approved. Some kind of institutional rules must be taken up so that debt accumulation and government spending can be affected. So the countries with weak political institutions basically are more ineffective, conflicts come up, and thereby some kind of institutional issues crop up. So another aspect is how these dictator roles like bureaucrats, interest groups, they can influence the fiscal policy outcomes. So either they prioritize the short-term electoral gains, or the bureaucrats resist from threatening the jobs, and as a result of that, interest groups may lobby for the government spending that benefits their members. So these are some of the risk factors which are there whenever there is a political intervention in the economic decision making. And these risk factors are basically leading with a kind of an authoritative role played by the bureaucrats who basically threaten any new policy to take up because their threatening is in the tune of job loss, or any kind of interest rates for the lobby for the government spending because they might not benefit the members. Because this kind of threats, which can be pseudo threats, can be created by this kind of agenda or by this kind of groups. Moreover, the behavior of the political actors also sometimes influenced by the formal and informal rules of the political system. Because today in the world of social media or in the world of globalization, most importantly comes up about the behavioral pattern of this political agenda or thereby the political parties, such as electoral system, party system, and the media landscape. Because today media landscape is playing an important role in actually influencing the decisive powers of the citizens, where we look at a proportional representation in the electoral system, or we look at the multiple parties. Everywhere we have seen some of the interest of the politicians to cater to the narrow interest groups rather than focusing on the long-term fiscal sustainability. Because in most of the cases, they are more and more concerned about the short-term measures rather than any long-term stability. Moreover, we can see a very high polarized media environment. This high polarized media environment also takes care of the digital media, the print media, and more importantly, the social media that comes up. where the media outlets cater to distant audiences, and thereby any kind of consensus on the fiscal policy becomes a problem whenever the media intervention becomes more stronger. So it's also influenced by the political competition and accountability. Political competition is a process by which every political parties want to compete with each other, and thereby they want to go for power through the elections. And in that way, any kind of mechanisms which call for better accountability must not stay for a long time because they look at the short-term benefits. So accountability refers to mechanisms through which political parties are held responsible for their actions, such as the media scrutiny, civil society activism, or legal enforcement. So any one of these are taken up as an instrument by these political parties to influence the citizens and also to keep on control over them. Thereby, in order to promote fiscal discipline, what can be the effectiveness of the fiscal rules? So fiscal rules are basically the regulations that need to be embedded within the fiscal system. Firstly, increasingly used by the governments around the world to promote fiscal discipline and reduce the budget deficit. So when we look at this, we look at curbing the tendency of the government to overspend during the periods of economic expansion. So when we have seen that the economy is expanding, particularly the demand side is rising, then the government also becomes highly proactive to go for rise in the expenditures. And finally, the debt levels reach unsustainable limits, and definitely the interest obligations are on the rise. So this has come up in majority of the economies across the globe. Most of these economies were initially the third world nations. They became the developing nations, and now they are tagged as emerging nations. But whether they're emerging or developing, the deep-rooted history lies how this reckless spending leads to uncontrollable debt levels. So there the effectiveness of fiscal rules come in place because it should look after the designing and the enforcement. So when we look at the balanced budget, it may be very strict from a very conservative approach, but actually it is embedded whether the economic growth can be taken up as a propaganda, so that the debt limit is not too high, so that the resources have to be diverted from public spending to finance these deficits. This occurs at large in most of the economies where the resource in the budget was initially allocated for meeting the education and the health, but because of this fiscal emergency, it has been diverted to reduce the deficits. And that is how the poorer classes of the society has to bear the burden, not only in the current generation, but also this debt gets shifted to the future generations. So the design of these fiscal rules are taking account of the political and the economic context, where we see that large levels of political polarization, that is a one-party system, they have difficulty implementing the rules on the basis of the fiscal policy because they might not be taking up the interest of the masses. So simple rules may be more effective in the countries with weak institutional capacity than the complex one. This is very much important because the rules have to be simplified and they have to come up through very, very normal procedures. Particularly the legal sanctions, the compliance mechanism, though may be costly to enforce, but they should come up within the fiscal rules. Political pressure can be effective in enforcing fiscal rules, but at some times the rules also are subject to manipulation, because most of the cases these are basically regulated by the think tank committees, which are mostly controlled by the bureaucrats or the top level politicians. So the market discipline can be effective in enforcing fiscal rules, but when we look at the market discipline, it is again governed by the forces of demand and supply, where government has to intervene to protect the interest of the common masses. So it is seen that in order to ensure a good fiscal discipline, the effectiveness of the fiscal rules depend upon the design and enforcement, particularly what are the steps can be taken up and how we can promote fiscal discipline and reduce the deficit burden or the deficit management. So in this particular political economy of fiscal institutions, we have seen that it is a complex and a multifaceted topic that plays an important role in the entire landscape of the nation. It's not only embedded within the economic parameters, but it's very much intersecting with the political landscape. So the nature and the designing of the fiscal institutions are governed by a number of factors, and one of the most important factors is the government's ability to ensure sound fiscal policy, maintain the public finances effectively. This is one of the most riskier part, because in most of the cases, this management of public finances becomes out of order due to lack of accountability and lack of compliance. And so the most important objective is no way the economic stability and the growth can be compromised. Secondly, it has been seen that whenever these fiscal rules are designed by the so-called fiscal institutions, which are mainly regulated by the government sector, they are heavily influenced by the political factors, such as the power dynamics. This power dynamics is a competition among the political parties to go one after the other, and thereby lacking any kind of political consensus, but only looking after the short-term gains. Interest group politics, which is one of the very much essential component of any political structure, and electoral incentives. So the understanding the political context, operation of the fiscal institutions, and the incentives and the constraints of the policymakers must be taken up carefully. So a good research is needed to understand how the fiscal institution should shape up, how the fiscal rules will be designed, taking care of the economic and the political dynamics in an emerging nation. And that is how we can go for a good governance model within an efficient and a structured fiscal institution.